Today, nearly 7 years later, the conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court struck down President Trump's ban on bump stocks. In a 6-3 decision that split the justices along ideological lines, the court has chosen to put fully automatic machine guns in the hands of any American who wants one. It is somewhat difficult to muster the energy to be shocked by that decision, because it is exactly the kind of ruling we have come to expect from a court that has been radicalized to push a conservative agenda against the public interest and against public support. In 2022, the court made it significantly easier for anyone in this country to carry a concealed weapon. That decision came in the same term that the court conservatives gave the right wing the thing they had been fighting for 50 years, overturning Roe v. Wade and ending the federal right to abortion. The following year, the court handed conservatives a victory they had again sought for decades by ending race-based affirmative action at American colleges and universities. It's fairly evident at this point that the Roberts Court is working almost exclusively to enact a conservative agenda, whether that's catering to the NRA and the gun lobby, or shrinking the federal government whenever and however possible, or by enabling a conservative majority that seeks to hold on to power using undemocratic means. And there is still more of this work ahead. Right now, we are awaiting yet another abortion ruling from the Roberts Court, one that could significantly hinder doctors' ability to provide critical abortion care to people who need it. We are awaiting another firearms decision from this court, one that will determine whether people accused of domestic abuse can purchase a weapon. We are awaiting a set of decisions where the court could decide to significantly curtail the government's ability to regulate the safety of the food we eat and the safety of the water we drink. We are awaiting a decision in a case that could see charges or convictions tossed out for hundreds of insurrectionists who stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And we are very much still awaiting a decision on Donald Trump's request for absolute presidential immunity, where at best the court will have significantly delayed justice for a former president who tried to overturn a legitimate election, or at worst, the court will sanction a president seeking to assassinate his rivals without consequence. If it feels like this is just a mountain of major decisions, that's because it is. As Mark Joseph Stern writes at Slate, the justices are preparing to hand down roughly 14 extraordinarily high-profile opinions, triple or quadruple the number of an ordinary term. Joining me now is Leah Littman, professor at the University of Michigan Law School and co-host of the excellent podcast Strict Scrutiny. Also with us is the great Michelle Goldberg, New York Times opinion columnist and an MSNBC political analyst. Leah, I was struck by some of the tone, even in Kavanaugh's opinion for the majority, where he writes, the plaintiffs are pro-life, they oppose elective abortion, and they have sincere legal, moral, ideological, and policy objections to mifepristone being prescribed and used by others. It is quite clear that these conservative justices are sympathetic to the fundamental argument. Am I misreading that?
No, I don't think so. And I think part of the concern is that by dismissing the case on standing grounds and finding that these doctors could not bring the lawsuit, they basically didn't have to answer the questions that were raised in the case about whether, for example, the FDA was correct to originally approve mifepristone, whether the regulations expanding access to mifepristone, allowing it to be provided via telemedicine, are lawful, nor did they address the possibility of the Comstock Act being revived as some kind of weird zombie nationwide abortion ban that wouldn't actually have to go through Congress, but some future Republican president and attorney general could enforce. And so what they did is they just said, we're not going to resolve any of those issues now, i.e. before the presidential election. And that essentially puts the issue in the hands of the voters who are going to decide whether to elect someone who wants to enforce the Comstock Act or someone who doesn't.
Well, and I mean, not settling it before the election also helps Republicans who know this is a losing issue for them electorally. I do wonder, though, there's not the same amount of smoke and mirrors when it comes to the gun lobby, Michelle. And what your reaction to their ruling on bump stocks is, especially in light of the ruling they are going to make about whether domestic abusers should have access to firearms.
Right. Well, I would say not just that ruling, but what I find really disturbing about this ruling. I mean, first of all, on the merits, it's, you know, this kind of ridiculous, highly technical argument about what a machine gun is and whether the function of whether kind of the single function of the trigger is about what your finger does or what the internal mechanics of the gun does. I mean, really kind of recondite stuff. And, you know, I think that Sonia Sotomayor had it right when she said something to the effect of, you know, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck.
It's a duck. If it looks like a machine gun and behaves like a machine gun, it's a machine gun.
Right. And not just that, but, you know, there's machine guns are illegal. And then there's a separate law from the 60s that makes implements that convert guns into machine guns illegal. And so it's, you know, so this is a, you know, kind of, it shows their radicalism, but it's not a radical. In this particular case, this isn't a Second Amendment decision. It's
an agency call.
It's an agent, right? And so they also have a big ruling coming up where a lot of people expect them to basically gut the ability of not just the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but kind of all federal agencies to pass regulations.
To do what they do, which is to regulate.
Right. And so this is, I mean, I think that this is, you know, an augur of a more shocking remaking of basically the kind of federal government.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Michelle is talking about the Chevron cases and JARCSI. I'm not a Supreme Court reporter, but there are two big cases that Michelle's referring to here, Leah, that would basically undermine the power of federal agencies to do their work, which is, I mean, first of all, the fact that Clarence Thomas is weighing in on the machinery of a bump stock clip in relation to machine gun clips. This is not what Supreme Court justices traditionally do. That is the work of the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The court doesn't want ATF regulating bump stocks, and so basically took their power away to do so today. And they have even bigger fish to fry in these forthcoming cases. I mean, do you think we're going to see a wholesale revisitation of one of the central planks of sort of judicial deference to federal agencies?
I think we are going to see a massive realignment and reallocation of decision-making authority within the federal government. Under the current system, the Chevron doctrine, as you were explaining, allows administrative agencies to adopt regulations that fill in gaps that are left by statutes that Congress enacts. If the court does away with the Chevron doctrine, it will be assuming that power for itself. That is, the people who just use 6 pictures and an animated GIF that were supplied by a gun advocacy group in order to justify unleashing bump stocks on the American people, those are the people that are going to be deciding the future of health, safety, medical, food, drug, environmental regulation if they actually do overrule Chevron. And there's also the JARCSI case, as you noted, that could also limit the power of agencies. There's also a case about an additional climate regulation, Ohio versus EPA. I mean, this June is just a storm, a catastrophic storm waiting to happen.
Can I follow up on that, Leah? Because it's just a staggering number of cases to begin with that they took on of huge national import. And it's not July yet. It's June 14th. I mean, they are going to dump these opinions on the American public and the American press, you know, in a way that threatens to overwhelm anybody's ability to make sense of them.
I think that's correct. And this is in some ways the new normal. The court is taking on a smaller number of cases, but a larger number of these huge, high profile, ideologically significant cases that could remake the American government, and then loading up those decisions at the end of the term so that people are, as you suggest, just overwhelmed. I mean, last term, in a single week, we were getting affirmative action decisions on West Virginia versus EPA, the Future of Clean Power Plan, also the case about LGBTQ equality and whether laws guaranteeing LGBTQ equality could be enforced in all circumstances. The term before that, it was about the future of gun control in Bruin, coupled with Dobbs, the court overruling Roe. Those decisions came back to back. And so the court is loading up these decisions, taking on smaller number of cases, but also bigger, more significant cases, and I think attempting to skirt the public radar.
Has anyone ever seen The Silence of the Lambs? The late, great Hannibal Lecter is a wonderful man. he oftentimes would have a friend for dinner.
That was Republican frontrunner and convicted felon Donald Trump last month, offering his thoughts on a cool new movie that was released 33 years ago. But did anyone question Donald Trump's mental fitness or even his basic connection to the time-space continuum? No, they did not. That is perhaps because after nearly a decade of this increasingly unhinged commentary, the American public has become somewhat numb to Donald Trump's particular verbal madness.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations. Your house just went down 75% in value. And they say the noise causes cancer. You told me that one, okay? And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? By the way, they never report the crowd on January 6th. You know, Nikki Haley is in charge of security. We offered her 10,000 people, soldiers, National Guard, so whatever they want. They turned it down. And we did with Obama. We won an election that everyone said couldn't be won. Like a memory question. It's like you'll go person, woman, man, camera, TV. So they say, could you repeat that? So I said, yeah. So it's person, woman, man, camera, TV. It's actually not that easy, but for me it was easy.
Is it really not that easy, though? Though President Biden receives far more press for his verbal miscues and mistakes, the reality is that Donald Trump is in a league of his own when it comes to strange non sequiturs and rambling anecdotes that lead nowhere and fantastical scenarios that have no basis in reality. Even against that backdrop, though, the ad-libbed hypothetical that Mr. Trump presented this past weekend in Nevada, it really stood out.
What would happen if the boat sank from its weight and you're in the boat and you have this tremendously powerful battery and the battery's now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there? By the way, a lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? A lot of shark. So there's a shark 10 yards away from the boat, 10 yards. Or here, do I get electrocuted? If the boat is sinking, water goes over the battery, the boat is sinking. Do I stay on top of the boat and get electrocuted? Or do I jump over by the shark and not get electrocuted? But you know what I'd do if there was a shark or you get electrocuted? I'll take electrocution every single time. I'm not getting near the shark. So we're going to end that. We're going to end it for boats.
Just to be clear, this scenario will never come to pass on planet Earth, in part because of the laws of buoyancy and conductivity, and in part because a former president will never, ever be in a sinking boat with a shark 10 yards away. It just is not going to happen. But as absurd as these moments are, as surreal as the sinking boat shark bite scenario is, there is weirdly a strategy in play here. Trump's apparent conditioning of a large swath of the American public to accept his incoherent rambling as normal, or at least as something other than addled and alarming, has become one of his biggest campaign advantages. With the spotlight on President Biden's age and acuity, Trump and all of his malapropisms have seemingly gotten a pass. And there is no better day to put Trump's aging but florid mind into perspective than today, because today is Donald Trump's birthday. Trump is now 78 years old, only 3 years younger than President Biden. While marking this milestone, Susan Glasser of The New Yorker offers this assessment of the Republican frontrunner. Wherever one stands on the broader question of Trump's mental health, the evident decline in his ability to speak clearly and coherently feels striking. If there were ever a case for age-related diminishment of a candidate, Trump is it. Joining me now is Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker. Susan, can we talk about this descent into ultra weird and what you have seen in particular that causes you to make this assessment?
Well, Alex, there's a lot of material here. Let's be real. You this evening have already played the shark electrocution boat thing, which honestly, I mean, I wouldn't pretend to, have any political strategist in me, but if I were a political strategist, I might suggest running that as a campaign ad over and over again. If one were so inclined. It's pretty remarkable stuff. Trump is a tough character when trying to unpack, which part is just who he is, which part has gotten worse over time. Certainly you look at the vocabulary, you look at the challenges, speaking in clear sentences and communicating. That is something that has changed pretty radically over time. I would say even from 2016 to 2020 to 2024, the progress of a Trump rally shows you pretty clearly a man on a sharp downward slope.
It's interesting because his campaign released a statement after people's eyebrows were collectively raised over the shark batteries buoyancy scenario. And this is what Jason Miller had to say, his advisor. President Trump takes on numerous tough interviews every single week and delivers lengthy rally speeches while standing, demonstrating elite stamina. First of all, I didn't know a stamina could be elite. But secondly, Susan, it's almost like what he says is beside the point. The fact that he's up there, standing, still talking is enough, the Trump team thinks, to placate anyone or dissuade them from thinking that he's somehow addled. And thus far, they seem to be right. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's way more scrutiny on President Biden than there is on President Trump, former President Trump, given the absurd tirades and non sequiturs that are now a part of his daily routine.
Well, look, that's right. And again, part of the problem is the fire hose of lies and BS problem, which is to say that if we already feel Trump has overwhelmed us with bizarre digressions for years, then unpacking what's new and different becomes so hard that people just throw up their hands. But remember, person, woman, man, camera, TV in 2020, Donald Trump has always graded himself on a curve in the same way that Jason Miller there is grading Trump on a curve, saying, oh, no, it's OK as long as he can stand up.
Yes.
That's a pretty remarkable standing up. Also, I thought Trump was running against the elites, and I've literally never heard anyone assert the condition of elite stamina. Have you?
No, I don't think I have elite stamina, for the record. I'm not sure I even have stamina.
I definitely do not.
Donald Trump has elite stamina. I do have to ask, though, I mean, this is all thrown into sharp relief when the two men are on stage debating, right? And it already feels like, the first presidential debate is set for June 27th. It already feels like the bar that is set for Biden to clear is so much substantially higher than the one Trump has to clear, which is literally, is he alive? Is he standing? Are the words coming out of his mouth? Setting aside what the words actually are. And I wonder if there's any way for Biden to overcome what seems like a structural disadvantage on, in the weeks leading up to what's going to be a pretty important inflection point in this campaign.
Yeah, Alex, I think that's an important question. We don't know the answer yet. The challenge with Trump, running against Trump for Biden, is that it's not really a head-to-head contest in which they're both being judged by the same terms. It's much more akin to sort of parallel play, not parallel, non-intersecting until the moment of voting play. Biden had that funny joke at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, right? He said, yeah, I'm running against a 6-year-old. But the truth is that Trump is engaging in his own game and appealing to his own followers who don't hold him accountable to the same standards as other public officials in this country. And so he, in quote unquote, gets away with things that I think anyone else would have a hard time doing because of what he's looking to do, which is to keep his MAGA base faithful to him. Biden has a much tougher task. He has a much more traditional view of the presidency. It's a much tougher job, the way that Biden has defined it. And so I think that's part of the challenge here. But when you see them together, remember that first fall 2020 debate between the two of them. That was, I think, a striking moment for many Americans. It probably did help Joe Biden put away the first campaign and defeat Donald Trump. Trump seemed out of control. It was truly, I think, the worst debate I've ever seen between any presidential candidates. And largely the tone was set by Trump, who was not just incoherent, but virulent and, just careening around. Remember, Biden's best line in that first debate in 2020 was, enough already, man.
Yes.
And, I think I'm a little bit kind of worried that we're going to see a repeat of that. It was pretty awful to watch, frankly.
Well, we do know, at least, that Trump isn't intending on doing any debate practice heading into one of the most important moments of his political career. So we have that unrehearsed Trump in the raw to look forward to on June 27th. Susan Glasser with The New Yorker, thank you for your time this Friday night, Susan.